There you go.
Yes. Hello to all three of you.
and we hope some to follow and more who will watch the video.
Yeah. Usually we have up to kind of 100 people watching this video afterwards.
Well, anyway, that's not the point, is it?
It's part of the
not the point.
It's part of the point. But I have to admit, part of the point is that I'm very much looking forward to talk to you and hear more about your work. So it's also always a good excuse to have a good conversation.
Absolutely. That's how I feel about that. We already started with Elizabeth yesterday.
I heard so, yes.
As a preparation for today. Yes. That's the beauty of dialogue, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
it just taps into some kind of an inspirational source.
Yeah.
And then you do look for that because you feel thirsty for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I guess for the people who will watch the video, it still will make sense to make a short introduction to Agota.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
And also
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So, Agota, I think the thing that there are several things that really jump out at me about your background, which would take us probably a good part of an hour to kind of go through your history because you've done so much. And but Agota, born in Hungary, born in a small village that she feels has rooted her in a context that she has never left her, and that's I think important because she's also someone who has traveled widely around the world. Agota has been a human potential pioneer since the 70s, and really exploring always the cutting edge, the leading edge of what is developing, what is possible. She's an educator, and starting with language education, but that has rapidly expanded to a lot of different areas of human consciousness development, human potential. As I said, she was one of the early pioneers with the folks at MIT, many of whom have gone on to become big names like Otto Scharmer and Peter Senge and Joe Jaworski. That whole Bill Isaacs, that entire crowd was a group that Agota was part of when they were running the dialogue lab at MIT, a real experiment with Bohmian dialogue, which is probably one of the deepest and forms of dialogue that I think, and the one that has gotten, I think, the most attention. And since, I mean, she created the Hungary division, if you will. At first it was sort of a subset of the Society for Organizational Learning in Hungary, but now it's its own organization. Agota has also founded several NGOs, nonprofit organizations that are committed to human development. And your recent work I find particularly fascinating because you're speaking about sacred democracy, cultural healing, and healing cultural trauma, and working with ways to create healing at levels larger than the individual, not excluding the individual, but larger than the individual. And that includes constellation work, which is something that's very popular in Europe, but less known in the United States and the Americas. Constellation work, mindfulness, dialogue, and presencing, I would say. And those are just a few of the modalities that Agota is working with and bringing together. So I hope that gives you a sense of where Agota comes from. I mean, there's so much more to say, but I'm really delighted to have you with us because it's quite an opportunity to talk to someone who has lived with the depth and brought things together in the innovative ways that you have. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I think that was it. The rest of the time we can spend in silence. And we are done. It's been very humbling, Elizabeth, to introduce me this way. Thank you so much. I guess all of us know this is an incredible experience when somebody is kind of reading you somehow. And I don't even know where you got all this information from, but
and she was not reading it.
Yeah, I was reading her life.
That's right, absolutely. You were reading into my energetic pattern, and there it was, everything written there. Oh gosh, yes. As you were introducing me at the very beginning, and you said that I was born in a small village, what came to my mind was that, yes, I actually think it's not necessarily the village, but the freedom I was experiencing in the village, you know, those days. It was just so extremely free and safe to stroll around and just to wander around and to experience yourself very unconsciously in a way. I do remember when I became more aware of the beauty and the nurturing aspect of nature. It was long later in my 30s. But in the childhood period, I was just fully energetically free. I think that's what I experienced. So actually, it was one of the reasons why when I had my daughter, I decided to move to a place not so safe and far away from the capital of Hungary than I was away, but something where she could also, how to say it, ingrain in her body and her beingness that the beauty and the importance of freedom. It is a kind of an inner freedom, of course. As we all know, in the 60s, the world was, in a way, simply, a lot simpler, with this polarity, you know, of the East and the West, and communism and capitalism, democracy, etc. So it was kind of an easy world in a sense, because we could just, many people thought that they know what the right thing is, either this way or the other way, you know, but and I think that's gone. That kind of simplicity about the world, that's long time gone. And those days, of course, I didn't know what kind of country I was living in. But as you were saying, it reminded me of it that soon after my father's death, I was 13, we moved into a town where I went in the secondary school. And the town itself is halfway through Vienna and Budapest, just halfway. And I remember we were always joking, you know, that if we had not had on either side this kind of so-called iron curtain, it would have been just always a choice whether to go to the right or to the left, whether to Budapest or to Vienna. But it was obvious that you couldn't go to the left towards Vienna, so you always took your route towards Budapest. But it was a kind of an in-between state. That's what I want to bring in. And as I was listening to your introduction, I was thinking that probably that's very typical of me, of really wanting to find the bridging potentiality in any kind of situation, even though I can be very, and you know me in different settings, so I can be very decisive and very razor edge like sometimes. In the depth of my heart, I have always been now in a what do you say in English? Hindsight. That's right. I see myself as operating as a kind of a bridge. First, as a language teacher, I was, you know, English, and I remember in the 80s, I always found it incredibly important that I would bring to the class not just a textbook, but actually I bought an old VEF, it's a Russian VEF radio, and the first cassette players, and I played early in the morning. I recorded the BBC News, which was kind of distorted, but you could hear that. I recorded it and then went into the class, and we were learning English through the up-to-date daily BBC News. And I realized that because that was a subtle way of opening the mind, you know, of people. It wasn't just learning the language, but it was really bringing in different kind of realities. And
I guess it was a connection. It was a connection of your subtlety and your directness, because to play the BBC News in communist Hungary is also kind of has an interesting. It's an interesting kind of subtleness to do this. Let's put it that way. And it really leads me. I mean, listening to the introduction that Elisabeth gave to your life and all the stations, and basically also how connected you are to the emerging field of, let's call it, dialogue work. That is something that we together are very, very much interested in. But also hearing you responding to it, in particular focusing on the village land experience where you come from, and your particular Hungarian experience on the other side of the Iron Curtain, which of course has also this kind of personal load that I was sitting on the other side, on the Viennese side, that you were talking about. Maybe it's an unfair question, but I would like to just ask you directly this overall question, because I'm just interested in your response to it. What is your work about? When you bring all this in, the life experience, the focus on dialogue work, the East-West, what is your, if somebody comes like I do right now and asks, what is your work about? Where do you start to answer?
Yes, it's I think my mom, if she understood English, she would be very grateful to hear my answer now, because she hasn't got a clue what I do. In the past 40 years, since I left teaching English, you know, and left the secondary school, she doesn't know what I do and what's happening. And it's a good question, and it's always challenging. But you probably know that for all of us, there are some fantasy names sometimes, but I don't really like using them. I believe there are many of us whose work, whatever we do in the story format, whatever the profession is called, is more deeply into, like my story with the village, more deep, or the BBC News, deeply into expanding understanding and assisting to dissolve some cloud which we all have in our mind. So the work is for myself as well, exactly the same, I guess, than the kind of work I can offer to others. And originally, as I said, it started with English language, but even then, you know, when I was teaching in a grammar school, all of a sudden, I think one of the core learnings of my work is to help people understand. By now, I know that things just unfold step by step, instead of really creating great visions, you know, and go for that against all difficulties. But it's more like learning to see and connect, and that's why I came up with this word of wisdom weaving, somehow perceiving the threads of different the threads of understanding, or the tapestry of understanding, and then learning to weave it somehow into a coherence, some kind of a coherence for myself and for the people around me.
Interesting, because that's a lot, the dialogue process.
Sorry?
That's a lot, the dialogue process.
I believe so. So I think I do remember when I was when I came across Bohemian dialogue, I must admit, I think it's a process of consciousness as well. In '88, I was in England for a long time. I was studying at the University of Surrey at the Human Potential Group, and came across different groups, people who started to work with David Bohm. So I went to an evening which was held by David Bohm. And I must admit, I didn't tune into what he was talking about. I thought that, so I didn't quite grasp what he wanted to say. And then a few years later, something shifted in me. And that something really had me to be completely inspired by the potentiality of the Bohmian dialogue. As you say, this bit by bit emergent process where reality becomes of who we are and how we connect. It was so inspiring for me, like coming home. You know? All of a sudden I felt like, oh, I'm at home. And since then, whatever I do, I think it's part of it. So people here in Hungary are getting bored with me, you know, when I say David Bohm or dialogue. But it was like coming home back to freedom, because in the Bohmian kind of dialogue, you experience freedom. You are not limited with limiting beliefs. If you have them, or you spot them or perceive them, you put them out, or you suspend them, or you're inquiring to them, etc., etc. So it's exactly like wandering around in nature and looking at it as absolute, with complete curiosity and freedom.
That's interesting, because I hear how this dialogue work is just very close to you, or very close to your heart. At the same time, there's another dimension that is connected to that. I mean, the first time I and Elizabeth met you was here in Frankfurt, in the context of our shared work in the European Forum. And every time we meet and talk, dialogue is a central aspect of where we meet, but the other is a social reality. And even when I hear you responding to the introduction, it's about land, countryside, and city. It's about East and West. You came from Hungary, then you stayed a very long time in one of the archetypic Western countries there is in England, which is basically somehow the archetype of Western democracy, to the good and to the bad. And I know that this kind of a social reality of dialogue is also a certain focus point, because Bohmian dialogue you can do in all kind of contexts, in just a group context, in personal context, family context, but there's a certain context, and that's also why we invited you to this program, because it's also very dear to our heart, that the dialogue is, of course, it's always a dialogue from a human being to human being, otherwise it's not a dialogue. But there are many contexts we're living in, we are holding a lot of realities behind us, and this cultural exchange from modernity and other societies, from East, West, to bring this in a dialogical, open, and particularly also open-ended conversation seems to be something that you're working with since quite a long time in very different ways.
I like what you're saying, because yes, that is very true. I remember having been part of a few dialogue groups in England, which didn't appeal to me at all. They really claimed to have been the original Bohmian dialogue. And one of the things was that it was too heady, and emotions were not really dealt with. And this social aspect somehow was not quite there. But I guess that maybe in the 80s, that was the right thing to do. Maybe. But what really, as you were speaking, I remember what really drawn me to the Bohmian dialogue was his proposal that by doing engagement this way, we might succeed in assisting to the emergence of a new culture,
Mm.
social culture in which we live. And that's the call for me in many of the things I do. That is the invitation. So either a dialogue or any other ways. So in that sense, I'm a socialist revolutionary, you know, let's put it like that.
All right.
But of course, it can be understood in many different ways.
Now we are talking.
well, but and part of that revolution is about freedom and healing.
Right.
Because part of what I hear you saying is that the freedom that you experienced in Bohemian dialogue was a freedom to allow it all in, to be able to hold it all in suspension together. And in that, you said you experienced a coming home, which is a healing, a sense of regrounding oneself in life in a deeper way. And I find that that also ends up being something that you really take and develop in your work as you've moved towards, because no one, probably very few people in the 80s were talking about dialogue as a process of healing, and yet that is what you found, and that's part of what you're bringing forward.
Yes. What comes to my mind is that it is definitely a process of healing into wholeness then.
Yeah.
To come to this wholeness and to experience myself and the others and the group as a whole, and potentially the society as a whole. And so actually, if I think of it, in the very, very early 90s, I was talking to a metaphysical teacher of mine, and I was saying to her, socialism is thrown out of the window now, and we thought of it as socialism, but of the human values, of peerness, of partnership, rather than major differentiations which lead to vulnerability, or from a social aspect to major poverty or something like that, so that your choice is restricted then. Because maybe our choice was restricted that we couldn't travel so often through the so-called Western world. But when you can't travel because you are poor, then it's still the same story, that you are without choice or action potentialities. And so when I came across with all these ideas, then I realized that what really attracted me, and there are some other processes which I have mastered or I drawn into my own learning process, where the idea of peerness is very strong. So that is why nowadays the idea of sacred democracy came into my mind very clearly. So the idea of peerness became very, very important for me, not only on the physicality, levels of physicality, like our wealth in the world, but it's also important. And for a long time I didn't know, probably you don't know, as a person to grow up, I didn't know beggars, I didn't know poverty the way we talk about it now. I didn't see people in the street. I didn't know homelessness. So for me, when I was between 30 and 40, all of a sudden this reality came to my mind, into my experience. And I realized that actually when we talk about the Bohemian dialogue, then what is important is the possibility of people co-led, co-created emergence, the field of emergence, so that everyone is there. So even the you were asking about my profession, I sometimes call myself from teacher to trainer, from trainer to consultant, from consultant to facilitator and coach and host. And nowadays, I think the yearning is to be none of that. But for example, I don't like calling myself teacher or spiritual teacher or any of these words, because somehow they create an inner association of hierarchy. And in the potentiality of the Bohemian dialogue and the social revolution, whatever that is, that we are about to do in the world, I think this co-creative partnership here and now aspect is very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I believe has been growing in the past, not just decades, but maybe centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment, I think many people feel that that's threatened. That because of the changing situation in the world, some people or some groups of people want to grab, power in order to make order, kind of thing. And certainly in Hungary, that's a very vivid experience for many people. But I know that it's elsewhere in the world as well. So in a sense of what we are doing, what you are doing, I think it's even more important now, so that it doesn't just become a social experiment, but we actually manage to root it somewhere really deep in the societal awareness that we are empowered human beings with a responsibility towards one another, and the question is where my sphere of responsibility lies, and it depends so much on my understanding of the world, of how I expanded my consciousness or understanding is. So the wider this understanding is, the wider the responsibility grows. The wider the responsibility is, the more challenge we have, to hold all that together. And in order to do that, I think we do need one another, like initiatives that you two are putting on.
I do have some more questions directly to that, but before I go there, Carol, you did have a question before, wasn't it?
Yeah, I was very.
Actually, Carol, before you speak, just 1 second. I invite Lynn, Nadia, Maria, join the conversation. You're welcome to. Okay. Yes, Carol.
Good. I was very touched by one formulation, of course, by all, but the tapestry of understanding that you mentioned earlier on. I'm bringing this into the foreground now at the moment because I feel that there's such an onslaught against understanding, bringing in relationships. And exactly in your phase of growing up, also in mine, in the West, it was the same. Things were isolated. And of course, dialogue is a big thing in this, but this whole area of starting to see how everything is related seems to me to be a big homecoming for all kinds of people right now. If I'm working with refugees or whatever, or working with different cultures, it's a real challenge, I find. And that's why I just want to say I was very impressed by this tapestry of understanding and how we weave that.
Can I would like to pick up the word, Carol, challenge, because that's what my experience is nowadays. Yeah. That in our little words, we might have assumed that we have a fantastic understanding and incredible human values, human rights, day and night, either on this side of the Iron Gate or the other Iron Curtain or on the other side. And when that collapsed, then everyone, everywhere, all over the world, etc. But in actual fact, when all these issues come home to my backyard or foreyard, then it's really a major thing. I remember that there is a 2 years ago, an ex-colleague of mine who in the early 2000s invited me to one of the universities where she was running the communication department to offer dialogue courses. And he, as it turned out, he belongs to the Focolare movement, if you heard of that. Focolare movement was born in 43, 42, 44, in the wartime in Italy, by a woman who was a young woman, and she was probably experiencing similar to what is being experienced nowadays, you know, of the helplessness or how to go around, what's the root of it. And then she started this Focolare movement of a Christian background, but it wasn't acknowledged by the church then, to bring in all diversities of all folks, of all kinds, to get together, etc. And later on, I think in the 60s, the movement got accepted by the Vatican. But the main thing is that the reason why he invited me was that they kept continuing their Focolare programs, you know, and it's not what I think I experienced, but it sounds a little bit ironic. It felt like we are doing the right thing, okay? We are doing the beautiful thing in the world. And then all of a sudden, there comes the refugee crisis. And then the Christian movement is being split into many, many different interpretations. And what is right and what is wrong? What shall we do? Shall we obey to our hierarchical, you know, structural, institutional orders which we live in? Or shall we try to find our inner consciousness, or follow the mental models which we have, which might have a different experience? And so they started to dive into this kind of dialogue very, very strongly, because it became an absolute challenge for them what to do. And one of the challenges, I think, was because of the hierarchical or authoritarian system, where the authority was still placed outside, you know, in the system, in the structure of the organization, which they didn't want to be infidel to. Yeah, it's a challenge. And as you say, to see the incredible diversity of ourselves, I mean, it's a challenge for me as well, a continuous challenge. And to understand, and then to see how they fit together, how they are interlaced, that takes an awareness of time as well, if I can put it like that. You know, back, and this is how we could go back to the healing cultural wounds. And by doing so, maybe we can envision humanity in 100 years' time, you know, with all the possible good potential, or 1,000 years' time, but where this fragmented identities somehow will disappear, and yet we can identify the different threads. I don't know, but hopefully that's the way it goes, and it may not be at all.
Yeah, but it's I think justified to have this hope. I would like to ask you, because it is definitely my experience, and very curious, someone like you who is for so many times deeply involved in this dialogue work. I really have deep hopes, just from the experience of working this way, that dialogue as a way of being together has the capacity to hold diversity in a very real, heartfelt, existential way. Because there's one way to hold diversity in a democratic context where we can talk about how to do this, and it's all fine, it's all good, it's all important. But in the end, the way we think it through, it's related to a mental concept of how diversity can be held. any kind of living dialogical experience like this right now is in itself an experience of what we are talking about. Because you kind of laid it out, basically what the challenge is. It's authority, order, aliveness, and diversity, and freedom of outcome. That are conflicting realities. And one way you can think your way through it, but another way, and that's what I appreciate so much in practicing dialogue, is that when we come together, as we do right now, all these questions are present right now, not as theoretical questions, but as the questions: how do we do this dialogue here on screen, where we are right now? Who is holding the hierarchy for what or not? And how is an open coming together possible like this? So what I find so extremely educational is that this is a learning process that is right now here between us, and it teaches us how we can live together in our open societies. And the learning process is not a cognitive mental one. It's something that is unfolding as we are talking between humans. And that's where I feel the skill of being aware. And that's also where I see the sacred dimension coming in, or the spiritual dimension. There's a sphere of aliveness, of humanness, of something opening up between us that we have to have a sensorium for, to allow us, to lead us how to come together, how to hold it open, and how to hold our different qualities to come here together, so that something powerful, beautiful can emerge between us. So in that sense, I feel that dialogue is a tremendously important practice for us as a modern society, that needs to be, first of all, practiced, but also understood and cultivated, because it is much more important than some small groups coming together. It really is something that is something that is foundational for an open society.
Yes, absolutely. What comes to my mind, one is a reaction, and and that's how, so dialogue can be healing, because it also opens a space for discerning the meaning of a few words, rather than just associating with that individually.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I saying it? Because at the moment in Hungary, for example, when I hear open society,
That's right, yeah.
then, already something has moved into my mind because of media and all that stuff. So all of a sudden, then I identify with Soros and Popper and, and something which started 300 years ago and which ruined real order and stability and value and certainty in society, which was there before. So these awful French revolutionaries, and so all of a sudden, all that is in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a dialogic space, as you say, it's a challenge to hold these two things in myself as well, without necessarily being partial. So it's an absolute challenge at the moment. And I think this is where dialogue as a human capacity is incredibly important. Instead of just immediately jumping into some conclusion, really noticing that, all right, there we go, open society. And what is it the others are talking about, and why is it so important for them? What holds them so stuck, or not stuck, but linked to a different world? So that's when I think dialogic capacity, individually and collectively, becomes very, very important. And somehow, after the war, at least in the European societies, it doesn't matter whether on the right side or the left side of the Iron Curtain, people thought they knew the right way. Yeah? And they were standing up for that. But now it is a question of how to hold these polarities together and wait for the emergence of something. What I want to express is one of my delight recently in my own language, which is Hungarian. Okay, it's a bit of a challenge to translate it, but it relates to what you were talking about. In Hungarian, the root of to converse and society are the same word. And the very root of that word means also to open. And because it's a T, imagine a T and an R, okay? So these two consonants. In between the two consonants, T and R, if you put an A or an R, as we call it, then it becomes the open, which then, when it's open, then it can hold things. It is an incredible mind map of associations. If you put an E in between, then it becomes square or space or to bear fruit, nature,
Wow.
the creator up there. And so partner in our societal word is társ, which means like you two are partners. Thomas, you are Elizabeth's partner, and Elizabeth, you are Thomas's partner, which is you are társad. And when there are many partners, alom is the word in Hungarian, many together, then it becomes society. And so I think originally, of course, we forgot about all that. And it's a real question whether the language holds still meaning or we completely ignore the beauty and the original, threads and of meaning which we dressed up in words or language somehow. So I haven't got a clue, because at the moment my present experience doesn't seem to be an evidence for the fact that the language related to thinking creates a different reality, right? It's as if we were completely completely forgotten this meaning potentiality. And yet, I think this is how dialogue, conversation, társalgás, can create an opportunity for people to become társ, to become partners. And as you described, when many of them are able to do that, that creates a society, basically. So I just exactly as you said, Thomas, that's been my call as well to this whole kind of work. And there are different other modalities. I think this new fashion of mindfulness also taps into that. People wanting to find the roots of their action and where it comes from and where their association and thinking is rooted, and how to observe that and perceive that without necessarily blindly acting on it. And I think in that sense, I do welcome the whole mindfulness movement, because every person must engage in self-inquiry if they start to do mindfulness. And the process of self-inquiry brings a different awareness where we probably are more connected to the processes and rather than the actual outcomes.
It's interesting because as you're speaking, Agota, you're describing consciousness practices. You're describing practices of self-knowledge, as you were just saying, but also practices of opening spaces that include that include human consciousness, opening our minds. And I found it very striking just to that the word, that the T and the R with the A together is open, with the tar, and coming around back to Thomas's term, the open society. That that there,
yes,
we have perhaps a more phenomenological, more consciousness-based sense of what an open society is or could be, because that quality of openness is not something that you find in the West in terms of our society.
But you inspired me so much, Elizabeth, now that when we finish the conversation, I'm going to write about that, something out on the Facebook in Hungarian for the Hungarians. So open society and
it's not Soros. It's not Soros.
Absolutely.
But just to think about that, the deeper meaning, and I think this is something that Thomas has been preoccupied with lately, but just think about the deeper meaning of what openness is. That openness not about permission, not about but about a quality of life.
Mm-hmm.
A quality in relation to life that is not fixed.
Absolutely.
Because very simply spoken, yes, and to break down something like open society to a dialogical context like here right now, what does it mean that we 7 people that we are talking here right now are able to meet in openness? Or are we even? And what does it mean to meet in openness? That's not Popper, that's not Soros, that's not kind of Western modernist understanding. It's just, is there a fixed understanding how we have to come together, or is there some deep trust between us that basically without preconditions, there is a meeting space that we trust in, that something can unfold between us that is beyond our control? This kind of openness is something that is also, as I understand, a connection between dialogue practice and mindfulness. Or to put Nadia here on this spot, because she's with us, Nadia really is very into understanding dialogue practice as a form of collective mindfulness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wholeheartedly. Go ahead, Nadia. Yes.
Yeah, and I think also there is a big gift in discovering the fragility of life together in this. Because what I got from what you said, Agota, I really realize that all those big tensions, culturally and politically, this is not something that people can bear as an individual. And the way how you are opening spaces is really, first of all, bearing witness together how fragile life is. Absolutely. And how fragile we as human beings are. And I really realize in listening to you that being together in this fragility already changes the whole situation, because it is really empowering to see being together in this, and that this is a potential.
As I was listening to you, Nadia, something came into my mind from very early times of dialogue. Out of those 2 years of dialogue project at MIT, after that, somebody who became very famous later on, Juanita Brown with the World Cafe. Juanita initiated with a friend of hers an international women dialogue, and it went on for 10 years. I'm yearning for that. We got together for a week. Most of us, there was a core group when new people came. But anyway, it was just for 1 week, like Bohm proposed, just to come together and see. And in that, one of those dialogues, I think there was more of a felt sense of being together than just the mind. And I remember once somebody said in the emergent process of the dialogue, I just realized that maybe the major reason why people are fearful of listening to the others is because if you really deeply listen, then this fragility comes to the surface and you may be changed just by listening. And so if we don't manage as a collective to get into this field of trust, which you describe, then the fear is always there. And because of the fear, we don't dare to listen in a way that something happens on a different level. But again, my language, as I mentioned, ter, so ter is space in that sense. And when, for example, Erwin Laszlo talks about nowadays the intelligence of the cosmos and talks about this intelligence of what the Vedic tradition called the Akasha field, then in Hungarian we have the same word for that as well. So for the field, we call tér, which again is connected with society. And so as you mentioned, Thomas, I believe if we manage to create this safe space, or which seems like in order to experience that we need to dive into the field, what we call field, in general, in English, then we have the potentiality of being with our fragility, as Nadia you say, and probably that opens to a very different social network to unfold. It would be wonderful, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But I think there is a lot happening. You know, it's like in small groups of people, like the 7 of us now, or gatherings. All of us go to different gatherings, and we already managed to develop that kind of sensing of that quality. So in a sense, it's almost like humanity is seeding the potentialities collectively for this emergent global space to happen. And at the same time, we hear that nature is changing, nature beings are changing. They are feeling more connected to us as humans. So I hope I'm going to live a bit longer so that I can
find out what happens next.
Absolutely.
There's something I would like to highlight listening to you, because when you're talking to this field, and even when you're basically opening up in the end to being basically you are talking something like a field that holds all of society and maybe even on a global scale, something as a field. The way you're talking, you're not just referring to an idea of a field. You're talking to something that is a collective experience as we are talking. You're talking to something that is experiential, accessible to me. I relate to what you're saying, not just as an idea. I also can hold that part. But there's something in my experience, my sense is that you're talking to the same thing that I'm experiencing too. And this is something only possible in dialogue. Because only in dialogue we hold in the presence living fields of consciousness. And that's a completely different relationship of also ideas unfolding, because this does not exist in the mental space.
Right.
The way I hear you, what I hear is not accessible to my mind. I have to open with different faculties to hear this part of it, if I don't misunderstand, but how I hear you, where you're talking from, and what you're talking to. But go ahead.
Don't mistake me, because I love English, and I wish I could speak many other languages. I tried German, for example, but it was very difficult for me. Or I started actually Norwegian, but it didn't get very far at the end, or I forgot everything, which I did. But Russian, not mentioning Russian, which was 12 years, and I still don't got it. So there is something about English for me, which stayed with me. But in Hungarian, this is what I'm hearing, that the quality of understanding is truly resonating together with a sensing field or a feeling field. And it's, again, just recently I realized that, and this is how we get touched. And that's what I'm hearing from you. Now, believe me or not, we have the same word for all three, the root. So I reach out and touch you bodily, air. Then you feel it, and I feel it. That is eres, with a Z. And when we really start to feel one another, then I am ertem. So the Z moves into the T, you know, the shift of the same consonant, basically. And so in full understanding, I need the feeling aspect and somehow this touching aspect, which you describe. I think that's pretty important for us all.
What's part of what strikes me about that is that the touching and the feeling, if I can make this distinction, are not simply, or the second touching is not simply emotional. It's presence oriented. It's existence oriented.
Right.
It's I in my selfness, in myself, I am touched by the presence of you.
Right. And that's when I become alive.
Yeah, and I become alive.
And in Hungarian, you know the thing of the two words R and L. They are also the same. In many languages, interchangeable.
Yeah.
And so air is to touch.
Yeah.
And el to live. Absolutely, as you say.
To live is to be touched. To be alive is to be touched.
Absolutely.
And that then brings us back to the fragility that Nadia was speaking about. Because that touching is also...
It's a very delicate process. Yeah. You can't just grab. Yeah. Absolutely. And actually a tiny little stream, let's say, coming out of the Black Forest, you know, which might add up to the Danube eventually. That, Thomas, we are at home, aren't we?
Yeah.
that tiny little stream, brook, or whatever that is in English, is also air in Hungarian.
Interesting.
So it just starts to come out.
Yeah.
So it's exactly the same word, like the understanding you described, the way you described it, Thomas. I think it's just like a small little brook of clarity or understanding, which emerges in us, or something like that.
But it's interesting because we're working. I mean, when we speak about these small groups around that the whole, in a sense, is trying to, through awakenings in these small groups and these different gatherings and so forth. For some reason, that connects with me to the small little streams that come through the rocks.
Right.
You know, that will create the river of life, or the rivers of life that are needed on this planet. You can. We were just in the Alps, by staying at a house at the foothills of this incredible mountain range, and there's a sacred spring next to it, and the
spring is a good word. It's exactly the same thing anyway.
Yeah.
You know.
And the water stays underground. The trip from the top of the mountain down takes 8 years for the water to go through, to come through, and it comes like a just with such a force through the rock, and becomes this vibrating stream.
Right, that's a lovely image.
But it's all these little pinholes of water, you know, pushing through the rock that makes this powerful force happen.
That's nice. It's a nice image, isn't it, for all of us,
Yeah.
for the next decades to see when is the time that it goes.
When will it break through? But yeah.
That's right.
In the good old Marxist times, we learned something like Marx was, and you probably know a lot more, Thomas. Something like the quantity, you know, the growth in quantity. There comes a moment when it just goes into a qualitative shift and change.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah.
And what I find amazing to experience is that in every dialogue, exactly that explosion is tangible, is living between us. So it doesn't need a lot of imagination, which doesn't help anyway. It is always only in the direct contact, in the direct dialogue, in the moment, where life is happening, where you know the spring is getting into life, is you know is just starting to create, or is already creating something, whatever comes out. But those are I think the most precious moments as human beings, when you connect in that way, that something can emerge out of really nothing, and creates the world, creates society.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so refreshing, isn't it? It's like really having a spring swim in the spring. Let's play with the words, because it's really, as you say, because it's created in a moment with the presencing of all of us, and then just it's like a wonderful, refreshing experience. Yeah. And I think this is where I going back to this sacred democracy. I don't do much about it. I was just glad about the term. And I must admit, at the beginning, it was a response, not necessarily a reaction, but a response to our Prime Minister's expression of illiberal democracy. And I was wondering, you know, where does that come from? Or why is it so important for him, you know? Because of course, and then I realized that there seems to be a main yearning for everyone to relate themselves to something. It could be certain values, or it could be God, or it could be a leader, or some ideology, etc. But then how to help, we were talking about it at the beginning, how to help people to keep the essence of what we understand about democracy in such a way that out of this oneness, which we experience in a dialogue, just as you described, I don't know what's your name, sorry, next to Maria, just as you described Maria, allow us to experience this trust which Elizabeth and Thomas, you described. And if society is able to do that, then I think democracy is not in danger, because we can see this aspirational point emerging from the whole, rather than through some ideology or some leadership. And that's how I was thinking that, yes, it's not an issue of liberal. Unfortunately, liberal really got very abused in many different ways as well. I think the relationship to money and economy made it like very vulnerable to many other meanings. But if we learn this, what we have been talking about, then actually the sacredness of us as humans on earth may emerge. And that's how somehow I relate sacred democracy in my mind.
I had an experience about a week ago, and I think it fits in right now, we're living in a time where, because of all this acceleration, we have to respond every day on internet and this and that, and we have to digest a lot of news, and yeah, the whole list that we all have to somehow deal with. And that means a tremendous acceleration in dealing with all the impulses, the feelings, and the news and so on. And we had an experience in the town of Constance where people were invited at the central square just to sit, not knowing one another, to sit and look at one another for at least a minute or longer, and not be diverted by, okay, you come from there and you have this on, and the whole business that we usually use in order to quickly figure out what's this situation all about, what's that person all about, where does he come from, and so on. Just get rid of all of this, look at someone for a while, and then maybe exchange, what did I feel? What did I see in this other person? Without knowing the name, nothing, the age, the job, all these attributes. And I noticed that after having done this with a few people, when I walked out of the town with my bike, I just had a totally different experience of the town. I suddenly saw everybody was just going somewhere. Everybody had a goal, and everybody was just busy with that thought. And nobody was really being aware of anyone else. Just being aware that you get around the person and you go through the town, and that you're following all your consumer ideas or whatever. They might be a lot of responsibilities, but this whole capacity to become aware of another person is really in danger. We have to create spaces like this, but we also have to somehow find ways of maybe performing this in other spaces.
It's interesting that you're saying this, and also as a response to what Agota just brought before, to sacred democracy, because the way I understand you, when you say the difference, you came out that you experience the other as the other. The way I hear you is it's also the other not in kind of an instrumental relationship. There's a certain quality of the otherness that, in my sense, relates to the sacredness that Agota was speaking about.
That's the point I got onto this example.
And in that sense, it's a very powerful example that simple exercises you were describing, just basically leaving everything aside that you're usually occupied with, something comes out that opens up the sacredness of the other being together, but a sense of the sacred. And just to allow this to be alive between us. And I think that's also what you were relating to a conversation like this. If you name it like this or not, but you can name it like this. There's something that is just not profane, has a different quality, and it's justified to maybe say there's something sacred to have a space between humans like this. And to allow this to be part of us is something very powerful.
Actually, it's really it's deeply shocking in an extraordinary way how close it is.
Yes. Right in the middle of town, where people are walking around there.
But I mean, even now, I mean, always that we can stop any time to recognize the presence of another.
Right.
And what you discovered was you just walk in the middle of town, and if you take the time to just spend a minute,
right,
that sense of being touched by the fact of being human, which is what makes me think about what you just said, Agota, about that sacred democracy might not be so far away. You know, that there is this something in us that is essentially human, that is that we're speaking about, and it's sort of unnameable. You can call it the sacred, but it's also, it's the thing, it's the touching itself that is what's so touching, what's so remarkable, what's so enlivening, and yeah, reminding us that we're not separate in some deep, profound way.
Absolutely. What comes into my mind is like, there's so much talk about the changes of eons, you know, or ages, etc. And if we just go back in history of what is the past 2,000-3,000 years, and you read some of the mystics, like Rumi, for example. Rumi and his poems are a love relationship with the divine, with the sacred, basically. And it may well be that those days, the focus, you know, of this experience was kind of upwards.
Right.
And it's almost like it's out among us now. If we dare to do that, if we dare to do that, that we can get in touch with whatever, I don't even put it up there, but that this experience in the city of engaging with another human being in this way opens up similar experiences or being touched, just like, let's say, Rumi or many of the mystics got 500, 600 years ago touched by. And I think that's the shift in the world. That's the shift in the world. That now that's the, if there is any task, but that's the line of least resistance to move towards us. And that's where dialogue again becomes very important. So it's like, it becomes a collective prayer to one another kind of thing, rather than to something out and beyond us.
It's powerful.
It's really lovely. I have a German friend from the co-counseling community. I am absolutely dedicated to co-counseling since '86. And in Germany, there is only one group in Münster, which is very, very steadfast because it's been on since the 70s. And co-counseling is like a one-to-one help process. But the perceiving the other in the way, Carol, you were describing it, is an essential part of that. And a friend from Hamburg started to experiment with just listening. He created a caravan, and in Hamburg, he set it up in different squares or churchyards where he got permission to do so, opened the doors of the caravan, and he just placed a table and 2 chairs, and he was sitting there, and waited for somebody to come and engage. Or he opened it and offered it to 2 people just to engage in some lovely conversation. And I think it must have been wonderful, the way it worked out.
It's also what Lynn just wrote in the chat box. I don't know if everyone saw that, Lynn. Maybe you want to say more to it, but what you're describing about the sacred conversations that happen between strangers in the bus is exactly this capacity that we have if we're just open for this.
Yeah, and that sounds very similar to the caravans where you don't know the person, you're just open to the person, and they're open to you.
Tar. Yeah. Absolutely. And so you become partners. Tarsh. Yes. It's magic.
Oh, and there's empathy tents that have been used. Sounds very similar too. I guess they've been set up in Northern California in various events, and people of very different, like conservative, Republican, motorcycle bikers have been listened to, and it's been good.
So yes, seeds everywhere, isn't it? So people do yearn for this kind of shift and change, and do act for that. They don't just wait for something else to happen, but those in whom the desire is already there, or the aspiration, they go about and act in whatever kind of restricted or non-restrictive way. But that's the beauty of it. I always loved this thing, when there was a time when everything was covered with concrete, that was the age of concrete, let's put it like that, pavements and roads and gardens and God knows what. Probably cement was very cheap, I don't know. But then somehow concrete cracked after a while. It cracks, doesn't it? And what happens?
Plants grow.
Absolutely. Yeah, plants grow.
I also would like to come back to one of the contentious words that we had in this conversation, because I think this dialogue as a practice is also capable of really creating solutions or creating understanding in that way. And it's again coming back to the open society and the reaction that you had. And my intention is not at all to kind of in some way defend this term, but the very opposite. Hearing you and hearing your reaction, and also with the understanding of the Hungarian situation I have, that there's a resonance in myself where I somehow can relate to all this kind of also defensive reaction of not necessarily Orban as him, but the people who sympathize with this, with people that basically understand open society just as the openness of the market, which probably mostly it also is. And
these days, yeah.
And there's something where just because I hear you, because this is a conversation, it's not just kind of about concepts that we're sharing, but we are meeting. And when I hear you, Agota, as a person, but I also hear the whole cultural vibrations from the culture you talk from in this. And I just realized this does something with me. I won't be even able to say what it does to me, but it touches me. And it changes my relationship to this word, because all of a sudden I have a direct access or a direct access with you to a whole culture that has this different relationship to this one term. And this is something that only happens in real relationship, in real dialogue. And it's not on my cognitive side that this is really happening. It's our capacity to be together in an existential way, where this term kind of work in a very different way, and understanding, I think, is possible coming out of this.
Yes, I had the same experience, as I said, when I realized open society and Társadalom, they are so much deeply connected. A new awareness opened up in my mind. And at the same time, as you say, it brings me back to the other topic a little bit of how to heal these experiences which restrict us with one aspect of the meaning to identify with, and forget about the rest very strongly. In a very different context, cultural, I do remember at the first International Women Dialogue, it was all Americans and English people, one or two people probably from Scandinavia, and me and a Romanian theater director. But a Romanian for Hungary means that she was from Transylvania, not a Dracula. She was from Transylvania, which for 1,000 years was part of Hungary, and only after the First World War was taken away and attached to Romania. So for us, for Hungarians, everything that comes from Transylvania is Hungarian. And if something as a Romanian appears, that's kind of an invader in a way, culturally. And then the interesting thing at this dialogue was because of this trust field, which we talked about already. At the closing circle of a one-week dialogue, everybody shared something very precious from home in their heart. And this young woman called Alina, she started to share with us an old Romanian ballad. And as she started to say the ballad, except for the surnames of the people in the story, everything was exactly the same as a ballad I grew up with. And then my first reaction, that's when I realized what you are talking about, Thomas. My first reaction was, they took away even our most famous ballads. No? Second reaction was, maybe there is a deeper level in that story and not a national identity kind of level. And then I started to search down, and yes, it has been an incredibly important theme of a story, you know, of human association. I'm not telling you the story. All around that Eastern Balkan, Carpathian area. And that was like, oh, I see, you know, a major shift. So the same expression, the same story, the same word, listened to from different cultural backgrounds, might create an incredible openness on a deeper level of a meeting ground. So one of my visions is that once we come together for summer dialogues, where everybody brings his or her history book from school, you know, and we just read the history books to one another with this kind of dialogic presence.
Oh, that would be so extraordinary.
And I think we would be very surprised, and maybe, yes, maybe we could heal a lot of what is presented to us on the level of the school educational system.
Yeah, and
lives with us.
And I agree with you, Lynn, that yes, I think that we each bear the imprint, a vibrational imprint, the karma of our cultural past, that we, and that there's something in that we can learn from, that can come on, can be healed in the connection. And I think that's what.
That means it's something personal.
Yeah.
You have no idea what it means to read parallel Hungarian and Austrian history books.
Actually, Agota knows that.
Absolutely, Thomas. You bring your textbooks, I bring my textbooks. It would be very interesting.
But actually, I was thinking when you said that this Europe Forum that you, Agota, Thomas, and I, and others are involved in, to create a Europe-wide conference that has depth to it, that's not just about economics and so forth. This would be such an interesting exercise. This would be such a powerful thing to do together.
Especially because of the 100th year, you know, the end of the First World War this year.
Yeah.
And the 2 more years afterwards, you know, of the peace treaties. I do have the vision, actually, talking about, for us, from a Hungarian point of view, because of the Versailles treaties, we lost, as you know, 2/3 of Hungary, etc., etc. But that's not the issue. I heard from one of the most, I would say, mentally violent person who is very active nowadays in Hungary, one statement that if we, he said, he is representing very much the government's view. If we had the opportunity to sit down in 2020, the 4th of June, in Versailles, at the Trianon Palace, at a major table, with all the country high-level representatives who had been there 100 years before, and we would have a process of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Wow.
He said we could let go of this national collective trauma.
Wow. That's amazing.
And I think it's true. And I think it's true that maybe to let go of all the wounds of the First World War, something like that could happen.
Wow.
And in Belgrade, which is Serbia, where two rivers, the Sava flows into the Danube, there is an island which is called the Island of War. And the second vision was, as an outcome of that, why not, this we are talking about now Central Europe, why not do again something so that the island becomes the island of reconciliation or the island of peace? Why to continue calling an island, you know, in the midst of a river, the island of war? And they call it the island of war since the Ottoman Turkish period, so 500 years.
Wow.
So that's aspects of, you know, vibrational pathways, how to release the vibration of wounding, which took place in any of the times, you know, and has been reinforced and reinforced through our stories, our textbooks, our family stories, you know, and all the official state memorial gatherings, etc., etc. How to release that vibration, which actually gets so trapped, I believe, in our stories and in our everything. We keep on reinforcing these wounds, in a sense.
That's right. I think maybe we should end there. That's a
I
perfect
think so. Yeah.
perfect thought to end with. Thank you so much, Agota.
Thank you so much. I really loved it, that it was not a talk, but a sharing together and really weaving together. Thank you.
Yeah. I really appreciate all of you for being here. And it gives us all new ways of moving forward in our separate paths and the ways that we ourselves weave together. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you do.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.